finally now, I'm getting near the end, and I'm going to say, okay, what are we going to do in education? And so far, mostly what I've been saying has been theoretical. Now I'm going to get practical, but practical at a very high level of generality. It's not practical about, go and do this specifically. It's practical at a very high level of generality. So here are 5 things that we might do in education. Firstly, we have to know how our learners are, which I've called the institutional and curriculum learning principle. So institutional principle is when you enroll a student, find out who they are. So asking a few of the demographic questions is not a bad starting point. But the curriculum learning principle is have a curriculum where students are able to bring in their life world experiences, bring in something of who they are, such that the curriculum is a place where you as a teacher in the institution, as a school, can learn who the students are. Now, how doesn't that happen? Well, it doesn't happen when there's a teacher standing at the front of the room lecturing. It doesn't happen when the textbook says learn this and remember it, and come in at the end of the week or the end of the semester and tell us what you've remembered in a test. So none of those things tell us anything about who the learners are. So they're things where a curriculum which is open to difference is one where the school is constantly learning. So from the moment when enrolment happens, when you need to find out a few things, because after all, this is going to be a very intensive interaction. A child comes to school, they're going to be there for years. A student enrolls in university, they're going to be there for years. So it's important to know quite a lot. In a former life, I worked for the Australian government, and we developed a thing called the Charter for Public Service in a Culturally Diverse Society, where I was working in the Prime Minister's Department, and we were working around general guidelines for all government departments about the way in which they monitor and track cultural diversity. So if it's a bus ride, you don't need to know much about the learner, about the passenger, because it's not a very, very intensive long-term interaction. However, if it's surgery in a hospital, you need to know a fair bit, which is, what's their medical profile, what are their religious preferences around food, there's a lot of stuff you need to know about the person when it's an intensive interaction like surgery. Schooling is an unusually intensive interaction, so we need to know a lot, but it's not just what we find out at the point of entry. It's this constant openness to learning, including in the curriculum itself. And in the points that I'm going to follow with now, I might explain how some of that might happen. My second principle is differentiated curriculum. So the classic curriculum of modern didactic pedagogy is, here's the textbook, everybody on the same page at the same time, answer the standardised test, and we're going to measure you against your success in getting the same answers as each other, right or wrong. Yeah, the same questions, you will get the same. Standardisation means you get the same questions, and we're going to measure you off a single standard. Okay, so that's not differentiated curriculum. The teacher giving a lecture at the front of the class is not differentiated curriculum. Differentiated curriculum is where students are allowed to operate at their own pace. They're allowed to choose things which, to some extent, scaffolded by the teacher, reflect their own interests. And in a standards-based world, the idea is that even though the curriculum is differentiated, students are all expected to reach the standard, but perhaps in their own way and at their own pace. Right? They're not going to be failed, they'll get there eventually, but we need to then negotiate around students' interest capacities bit by bit. And in a way, the contemporary e-learning environments make this easier to manage. This was always a very ambitious thing. It was complicated and difficult to manage. But this new generation now of e-learning technologies, which are able to monitor what students are doing, give them responses, allow a greater degree of what's called personalised learning. Now, differentiated curriculum is now, there's no excuse. It can be done easier than in the past, and that is based on the acknowledgement that not all the learners are the same. The lecture, the traditional test, the textbook where everyone was on the same page, it tried to pretend the differences weren't there. Well, we don't have to pretend that anymore. The third point is to recruit learner agency, which we call the design principle. So the simple example that I often give, a kind of a trivial, simple example is, okay, we're going to teach volcanoes. I'll give you a volcanoes lecture. I'll give you the volcanoes textbook, and then you do the volcanoes test. okay? I haven't recruited any learner agency, or very little, not much, put it that way. But if I say to you, look, create a volcanoes project, choose a volcano that interests you. I come from Australia and they're not classical conical things, they're lava tubes that flow along the ground. And by the way, someone else might have read about this incredible, huge volcano at the bottom of the sea off Japan, and somebody else might be from a part of the world, they might be from Italy and they want to do something about Mount Vesuvius. So even at that kind of trivial level, allowing the students some degree of agency to choose what they're doing and some degree of volition in knowledge production. Now, here's a little formula. You allow, to the extent that you allow scope for learner agency, differences will become visible. They're not visible when you don't allow any learner agency. But the minute you allow learner agency, the differences become visible. And the more agency you allow, the more visible the differences become. Interesting. So this is, if you like, it takes me back to principle one, the learning curriculum. The curriculum learning principle is that I have created a curriculum with my little volcanoes exercise, which in a trivial kind of way is capable of learning about the learners and teaching me, the teacher, about the learners as I see them do their work. Number 4 is to nurture productive diversity, which is what I would like to call the collaboration principle. Okay, the kids come into the classroom, the learners come into the classroom, and they have all sorts of different experiences, different interests, different abilities. And how can we match those things? How can we bring them together so those differences are part of a productive, collaborative learning community? We might do that via peer review, where I do my volcanoes project and 2 people who did 2 other very different volcanoes projects give me feedback from their perspective, and they tell me things that I hadn't quite thought of before, and that's really interesting. I hadn't seen it that way. So we can build environments where the value of the environment is the range of feedback that you're going to get and the quality of the interactions. When I say quality, I don't mean high, low quality. I mean the qualitative differences in the perspectives that are brought to bear in the interactions between the students. And then finally, what do we do when we do assessment? Well, standardized assessment is, okay, we're going to measure you all by the same thing. We're going to insist on inequality. And how we're going to do that is we're going to say only a few can be excellent. And the rest of you, you know what, you're mediocre, and you people over there at that end of the curve, you're stupid. Well, let's be blunt about it, right? And you go away with that message, even if it's not spoken in those terms. So what we do when we measure you on a kind of a scale of similarity, we're going to insist on inequality. Okay, what we might do though is across these different volcanoes projects or across the different work that students do, in addition to pushing towards mastery, which is in fact going back to the design principle, you keep working on stuff until the point where it could be as good as each other. You go at your own pace and you get there, you reach the standard at a certain point. In addition to that, we're going to get you producing work which is different, and what is valuable is the comparability. It's an equivalence. It's not that these things are the same. So you've done a fabulous project on your volcano, I've done a fabulous project on mine. They're really different from each other. They have different qualities. But in terms of a set of criteria that we might have taken from physical geography or geology, because depending on whether we're doing science or geography for this exercise, we're going to measure the comparability of different things you did against a higher order set of standards, right? It's not simply literally the empirical thing that you did, which has to be the same. And behind this is kind of a general principle that we speak to often, which is you don't have to be the same to be equal. I'm going to end now. I'm going to tell the end of our Roma story. This was part of an incredible piece of work done by Litsa Tresu, Sula Mitakadiou, and Jota Karagiani, colleagues of ours at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece. And it was a project funded by the European Union called the Education of Roma Children in Central Macedonia, West Macedonia, East Macedonia, and Thrace, which is right across northern Greece. And this was the culminating activity of the grant. The grant ran out and the project doesn't continue, and hopefully there's some germs of success which continue. The final culmination of the grant was a festival held outside the White Tower, which is kind of the icon of Thessaloniki. You can see there is a kind of an irony. The festival was there, and there was the picture that I'd taken of the little school, which was brought right into the centre of the big city there as part of this festival. There were women there doing traditional craft work, which in this case was needlework. There were women cooking, which in fact they were cooking the universal modern food, which is fried potato chips, but for the purposes of the of the festival, we might call it traditional Roma food. And there was music. I mean, if people know the whole world of the culture of Roma, gypsy music is pretty amazing and pretty incredible. And look, these were not kids who, they might have come from very poor circumstances, but they all had their devices. They were making movies of what was going on, and they all came in for the festival. An interesting kind of racial point. These are some of the young women who were there. You might notice there that the girls, and this was a subject of one of our colleagues' research, the girls use a skin whitener. So is this a phenomenon of racism? So in other words, they try to bleach their skin so they look whiter than what they would otherwise do if they didn't bleach their skins. The question is, is this the other side of racism? But then again, people use cosmetics of all sorts. So, I mean, it may be not a question where there's any judgment to be had about that, but interesting phenomenon nevertheless. So here we are, I think at the end of the day, given the fact that Greece is in this terrible economic crisis, Europe's not working very well, the project of inclusion is one which is going to have a pretty checkered future.